All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning into the third installment of Book Arts Toward Liberation, Body as Archive, featuring Aimee Cox and Autumn Knight. This program, like I said, is being recorded and captions are available by clicking the closed captions icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We ask that all participants have their cameras and microphones off. My name is Devin Manibo, and I am the marketing manager with Center for Book Arts. For nearly 50 years, the Center has been committed to promoting active and accessible explorations of the book as an art object. And today we serve as an international hub for research, practice, education, collaboration, and exhibition, showcasing the multitude of forms and processes that the book can take, with an emphasis on cultural equity, expansive dialogue, and economic access for all makers. We're so very thrilled to partner with the illustrious Jina Valentine and Heather Hart of Black Lunch Table for Book Arts Toward Liberation, a lunchtime conversation series centering Black voices in the book arts, publishing field, and beyond. As an effort to expand the discourse of Black visual and literary artists, printmakers, book artists, and Black-owned presses, Jina and Heather will moderate a 4-part series over the course of the fall 2020 season, harnessing space to discuss themes and topics within the intersections of Blackness, production, and creative placemaking, and to broaden the scope in which we think about what constitutes the book, from language to performance to the body to the collective. Special thanks to Stephen Berry, Deirdre Lawrence, David Solo, and everyone who contributed through our Broadsides for Black Futures fundraiser for their generous support of this series, and also be sure to check out that broadside collection in our bookshop to help us fund the next iteration of this program. All right, Jina and Heather, I will let you two take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, thanks, Devin. Hello, everyone. I'm Jina Valentine. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm just going to start things off with a brief statement about the Artist Versus series. This summer, Heather and I were both watching Jill Scott versus Erykah Badu on Versus, dancing, finding a recipe, and cooking, each in our own respective cities, and we felt a soothing in our souls. We felt broken from staying inside and embattled by the news. But this moment was a salve. These are musicians who have been and remain seminal for us. They transport us. They spark a soundtrack to memory. Seeing them empathize with each of us and with each other as we sheltered in place. They reached through the digital space to create something together, and it felt like a moment we will log in our collective archive. They connected us through our phones, tablets, laptops, desktops, all over the world. For one evening, they collected us. Folks in all of the places felt this love, this mutual respect and community, despite all odds.
Prompted by this series, we considered the outer limits of what constitutes a book, or specifically an artist book, artist plus book, artist equals book. We determined that books contain language in many forms and invite a corporeal experience of media and speech acts. We consider the book as it is constitutive of the archive and as it is representative of the body of knowledge, extension of the body. From these considerations, we determined abstract themes for our 4-part series: coded language, technical writing, the corpus, body as archive, and multivocality and self-authorship. These categories have guided our conversations around and planning for the series.
So today's conversation is based on the topic of body as archive. You intone, inscribe, embody, inherit, bequeath language. Your body, language, is an ode to the epigenetics and a living archive of internal and external communication. How do you document, map, or notate the body while performing the archive? Communities plus hierarchies, politicized and regulated. How is the body as archive performed or perceived or unmarked and sustained? We were excited to imagine what a conversation between Aimee Cox and Autumn Knight might produce, in particular, given the various ways both their practices have engaged the concept of body as archive.
Aimee Meredith Cox is an anthropologist, writer, movement artist, and critical ethnographer. She is an associate professor in the Anthropology and African American Studies Department at Yale University. Her first monograph, Shapeshifters, Black Girls and the Choreography of Citizenship, won a 2017 Book Award from the Society for the Anthropology of North America and a 2016 Victor Turner Book Prize in Ethnographic Writing. She's also a dancer and choreographer who has performed and toured internationally with Ailey 2 and the Dance Theater of Harlem, and has choreographed performances as interventions in public and private spaces in Newark, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn.
And Autumn Knight is an interdisciplinary artist working with performance, installation, video, and text. Drawing from her training in theater and the psychology of group dynamics, Knight makes performances that reshape our perceptions of authority, figures, power dynamics, and audience expectations of live experiences. Autumn's work has been presented at various institutions, including the Crown Art Museum, Human Resources in Los Angeles, Akademie der Künste in Berlin, Project Rowhouse's Houston, and the Crystal Bridges Museum, among many others, and her work was included in the 2019 Whitney Biennial.
Please join us in a warm welcome for Autumn and Aimee. Mike, pass to you.
Thank you for that. Hey, Autumn.
I just want to thank Heather and Jina for putting together because I am so excited to talk to you, and it's just great to be here.
Yeah, I feel the same. When I saw the invitation, I was like, did you read my mind? You know, lately in these COVID Zoom times, talking over Zoom is so exhausting, like even teaching over Zoom and like trying to give a talk and trying to break through the screen. But when I saw your name, I was like, oh, we're really about to have a real conversation, which is what I'm yearning for, right? To just like be in dialogue, to not know where the conversation might go, and let it wind, but not feel like we have to rehearse our thoughts, right? To really be thinking together. So I was so excited by the invitation. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Jina. Thank you, Autumn. So I don't know, where should we start?
Well, just to give a brief introduction about who we are and what we do, just in case people are unfamiliar with our work.
Yeah.
Would you like to go first? Would you like me to go first?
Why don't you go first?
Okay. Okay, I'll do a screen share. I'm just gonna show some images of something that I've done and talk a couple moments about it. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is from a project that I recently completed with the Kitchen in New York. And I basically picked some images from the first iteration the body and the embodiment and movement. So I do a lot of live performances, but this one ended up being a performance for video. And I basically really used the building as my performance partner, as my set, as my architecture, as my installation. And I did a long form improvisational performance with objects that I had set up, and really sort of played with them and explored them and danced with them and tore them up. And this was live streamed in August. And so here are a few images. This is a departure from what I normally do when I usually talk to a live audience. I usually interact with and touch a live audience. This was an opportunity to really get into my own body, but without showing my body, the entirety of my body. And we'll talk about that later in the conversation. And so I really worked with what was in the space. I had an amazing film crew to follow me around. This is these are images from last year. at the biennial, I did several performances of Sanity Television, which is a performance that I do where I interview audience members. And this was in the boardroom of the Whitney. And the audience, the performance included a bunch of different things, but I took a moment out of the performance to basically do a short improvisational dance or movement piece that, had some really, moments, some faux modern dance moments, just because sometimes you just have to do some dance and movement.
That's right.
Just because. You know, um, this is an example from, I actually had a dance residency right before I came to New York in 2016, and I worked with another performer, and we worked together to experiment with dancing and moving with objects and language. So this is me sort of working through choreography, right? Or trying to be a choreographer, trying to just talk about what it meant to move as Black women in our bodies and do some things that didn't make sense, right? I also make, and my drawings are very much about the body and about a distortion of the body and a pride in the distorted body. And these are more images from the kitchen, where I really tried to extend the movement to my extremities as much as possible. Okay, I'll stop right there.
Thank you for that. I love the kitchen, that kitchen performance installation. I call it both things, and it's like an intervention in space. I loved watching all of that series was so beautiful. I'll share screen too, but first I guess I should say that when I think about the question of embodiment, it's always been something that has been on my mind from a very young age. As a dark-skinned Black girl growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1980s, I was made aware of my body. I was very much made aware of my body in space and how my body impacted space and impacted other people, and how I should work to manage and discipline my body. It was something that was just so clear to me. It wasn't even spoken, like just from a very early age, it was so clear to me what I needed to do to be safe, right? Or to not be seen, or to be seen, depending on the context. And I remember so clearly, my mother was a school teacher, and she had taken off from work to raise my sister and I for a few years. And those days, I really miss those days because I spent a lot of time with my mother, like in department stores, and we would just be out in the city together. And I watched how she changed her corporal management of self as we moved through Cincinnati, right? And how the way that folks talked to her, and I remember always saying to her, "Why are you so mad?" I'd be like, "Mom, why are you always so mad?" Right? And now, like, now I realize like why she was so mad. But I was like, "Why aren't you smiling? Why?" And like I would see her stiffen up in her body as we moved, as we went shopping through these different department stores. Anyway, so my relationship to body started very early in terms of the way that I was thinking about bodies in relationship to space, like corporality and spatiality and what that looked like, and our potential not just to be transformed by the spaces that we enter, but to possibly transform those spaces. And what does that mean when you are all of the things that are defined as not being able to have a certain type of agency in this world, right? Not just female, but Black, not just Black, but dark skin, not just a woman, but a girl child, right? All of these things that are meant to disempower you and to distance you from your own body and your own, not just your sense of self, but from your own embodiment, right? And it wasn't until, to be honest, even after having danced professionally and being trained as a dancer for, most of my life, it wasn't until like a few years ago, as I approached 50 years old, that I really feel like I own my body, right? Or that I can really make claims to my body. So I'll share screen just to show it might be helpful just to see some images. Excuse me, I'm so like, move this out of the way. Okay. And Autumn, tell me if this comes up, if you can see it. I don't think it's up yet.
Can't see it yet.
Okay, I think it's opening, hopefully. Okay, here we go.
It's opening.
Okay. Okay, can you see this picture? Okay, that's me 25 maybe years ago, the bottom right. This is me dancing with Ailey's Second Company in the 90s. And so my understanding of embodiment when I was younger was very much about how I could or could not, how I was able to or unable to use my body as a way to express, right? As a way to narrate my own life. And so when I was younger, I didn't really see a distinction between expression that happened through the written word, expression that happened through speech, and expression that happened through the moving body. They were all very much a part of my lexicon. And I felt safe expressing myself in these ways, even as I knew that my body was not safe. And then I moved to professional dance training after college. I was dancing throughout high school and then as an undergraduate, but at Ailey was where I really got like this very intense, specific Black dance, concert dance training. And it changed my life in ways that were really powerful and generative, and also in ways that further distanced me from feeling that I have ownership over my body. So there's a different disciplining. So there's disciplining that was happening as a young girl in Cincinnati by virtue of being Black and female and young. And then the disciplining that happened in the context of concert dance, where that kind of disciplining was about a certain type of physical aesthetic, an achievement of a certain sort of virtuosity in movement. So there was like a skill in how you moved, right? So there was an evaluation that was different than the social evaluation, but similar. And it was crazy making, right? Because I saw Ailey as a place where a multicultural Black-based dance company where movement was about expression, right? Movement was about telling a story. It wasn't about the aesthetics of the body. And that's not what I found. I mean, it was a beautiful time in my life, but it was also, you can see the fear on my face, a time where I realized, oh, my body is also still not quite right in this context, right? So in the world, it's problematic, but I move into this space where it should ostensibly be a place where I am received well, and I feel like I can reclaim my body because I love to dance. This is a Black space, right? This is a space that elevates Blackness, but yet I was, again, constrained and policed in terms of whether or not my body was acceptable or whether or not I was embodying my own body in the right way. And so it was both in terms of achieving an aesthetic ideal, right? A very, aesthetic ideal, high legs and, arched feet and all of the things that we associate with Western sort of ballet, but also a sort of spiritual ideal or cultural ideal of Blackness, right? And both of those things had to be in the same package, right? In order to be successful in that realm. I'm gonna speed up, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, but, and then my concept of embodiment and dance completely changed years and years later when I was doing ethnographic work in Detroit, Michigan, and met a group of incredible young women, most of them like teenage young women between like 15 and 20, who weren't trained, right? Weren't trained in the ways that I had this dance training, but knew the power of their bodies and used dance and writing as ways to not only collectively create a space of healing, but to have something to say about things that were happening in Detroit at that time. So they created artwork to perform on the streets of Detroit so that they could engage people in conversations about what was going on. And I was like, oh, I forgot, right? I forgot that being in your body or dancing is more than just performing, right? It's more than achieving some aesthetic ideal. There's so much power that we have in our bodies to do different sorts of transformation in community. And then I, from work with those young women, I continued to just, I mean, I have to say, like, teenage Black girls will save the world. I really believe that. They are the wittiest, the bravest, the dopest humans on the planet. And so I selfishly just wanted to continue to work with these young Black women because they were reminding me of myself and bringing me back to my own body in many ways. And so this is just a clip from some of that work that was carried into Newark, New Jersey. So from Detroit, we continued to kind of use the tools that those young women in Detroit gave us to think about embodiment and writing and community engagement. And what that might look like on stage. So this is in Newark with the Blacklight, Young Women of Blacklight in Newark. And then, I keep having these encounters with my own body and trying to figure out what it means as a collective body, collective Black women in their bodies, and what does that mean for collaboration. So these are just two stills from my work with Simone Lee, who her work has really changed the way that I also thought about body and even breath. And what it means to think about embodiment, not as something like externalizing that people can see and that you make legible, but coming to a sense of embodiment that is very much about the interior. And so on the left is a picture where I was put into a pot that Simone made to fit my body. And there's that sand up to my neck, filled up from the bottom up. And it was summertime and I thought I was gonna die. You can see the sweat on my brow, but it was in that moment that I realized I didn't really know how to breathe, and I trained myself how to breathe in that moment in that pot. And so the other still is my body's covered in sand, and then my body's wet with water. But like in that work with Simone, I was just brought to a different understanding of what embodiment could mean, and kind of like an internalized, like not like how people see me and how my body is policed, but how do I even police myself, and how do I return to an understanding of being embodied that doesn't have to be about presentation or demonstrating or legibility or representation, but is about a deep, deep feeling that doesn't always need to be expressed to anyone. And then this is just a picture from work with Saya Woolfolk, who's a multimedia artist. And this is in the Fulton subway terminal here in New York City. And we, just to keep it short, it's a longer story, but we basically interrupted rush hour at Fulton Terminal with this kind of ritual dance performance, which involved iPads and phones. So the people in the audience could take holograms of us and actually make the holograms dance with us. So it's supposed to be a commentary on technology in public space, how we do and don't see each other. And then rather than seeing technology as an evil, how can we bring it into the collective movement space? That was like 3 years ago, I believe. And then this is from my latest project, my ethnographic work in Cincinnati, Ohio, which again is my hometown. I interviewed a group of intergenerational Black women activists in Cincinnati, took their interview transcripts and translated it into movement and gesture. And then that movement and gesture became a public performance in Cincinnati that then included a processional through the streets. It was one of the most difficult things that I've done, and we can talk about it a little bit more. I have various thoughts about it. I don't know if it was, I don't know. There's ethics around it, around all of this work that I love to talk about. And this is just my favorite space to be in, just dancing with folks and just dancing and moving, freeform dancing. This is from a dance class here in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. And I'll end there, but I guess what I would say is that, over the course of my life so far, let me stop sharing this. I've been thinking a lot about, where I am made to think about embodiment, and where it comes up and where I forget my body and the different contexts in which that happens or doesn't happen, from being just growing up in a certain city to, then working in the academy and trying to figure out how to bring a sense of not just the individual body, but collective bodies into the work in a way that is meaningful and attends to spirit and attends to all of the things that are so far beyond the academy in many ways. So yeah, context informs a lot of the way that I try to think about what's possible or what constrains how we are able to live fully in our bodies. and I'll stop there. Is Autumn, did we lose Autumn?
I feel like maybe we lost Autumn for a moment. I know she was having some internet troubles. Hopefully she'll jump back on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll continue to talk until we
Okay.
get, I don't know. And who is that? Is
That's
that
Heather, sorry.
Heather? Okay. And Heather, if you want to ask me any questions, we can, chop it up. But yeah, I mean, I think the question of embodiment is inherently a really complicated and fraught one for Black women, for all the reasons that I believe that probably everybody on this Zoom can imagine. On birth, right? The moment that we breathe air, we're considered a problem or a problematic, right? A problem to be solved. And, the problem of Blackness is something that I think what we know is a part of our historical sort of understanding of what it means to live in Black bodies. And it just continues into the present in the ways that we understand how we're marked for death. And beyond kind of the spectacular death of, for example, state violence and police violence, we also know that marking on our bodies that happens through gradual or slow death, right? In the ways that we are able to or not to live our lives in terms of the communities, the protections or lack of protections in our communities, what happens through these institutions that are meant to train us and discipline us in these different ways. And so just thinking about what all of that means for Black women is really an important part of my larger work as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, but is always has, out of necessity, is rooted in an understanding of the body. Autumn, I see that you're back. Thank God.
In San Francisco.
I was just
Thank you.
blabbering on. So basically, Autumn, I think you tapped out just as I was finishing my long spiel. But yeah, and I was just talking about the inherent difficulty in thinking about embodiment when you live in a body that's defined as both Black and femme or Black and female.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for carrying on after I disappeared. Your presentation was so lovely. It blew my internet up. I forgot, I didn't get to hear the last part of, what you presented, but I know I wanted to ask you a question about collaboration, right? And how you encounter collaboration, like how do you communicate the types of I guess freedoms or acknowledgement of agency within the body, like as you work with different groups, or even as you are invited into collaboration, like how do you think that conversation happens?
I think it's different in each context. So, and I think I see these collaborations very differently, and I see my role very differently. So for example, I think one of the more traditional collaborations, I guess, in sort of an art world context, which is not my world. So Autumn, please, you can tell me if this is if I'm off base. But for example, when I worked with Simone Lee or Saya Wolfoff, there is already sort of a basis of a friendship and a relationship. And but interestingly enough, particularly with Simone, we didn't do a lot of talking about the historical subtext or the context of the body, right? And so much of our collaboration happened in the way that you would if you're at your friend's house and y'all are just chilling, and it's like, you're just like, get in this pot. Like, why do you not make this pot for you? Can you get in this pot? I'm gonna put some sand in it and we're gonna film it. And but there wasn't a lot of conversation. I mean, we do that just organically, but around the work itself, I think the basis of the relationship and the connection of the friendship was the foundation for that collaboration. And it didn't need to be explicitly defined through the work, which I think is both interesting, and I don't know if it should have been, because there's things that I take away from that time, like being in the pot or being covered in sand, or even a lot of the work that I did with Simone was kind of ancillary to her work in museums. When she had a museum residency, I would, for example, teach dance classes, right, to the community, or provide some other sort of practice-based work or work with young women. For example, in the new museum, when Simone had that months-long residency, I was teaching young Black women in the boroughs, like Black feminist theory and dance as part of that. That was nothing that anybody saw. That wasn't a part of, like, it wasn't public. It was very much a private thing. And we did talk about that. We talked about the intentional nature of the work as something that is sometimes for an audience and sometimes for a viewing public, and oftentimes just for us, for ourselves. And so I do think that that collaboration, particularly with Simone, was about playing with that false binary between, or real binary between, the public and the private, and what is for us, and what work do we make sort of for ourselves as a sacred collective, and what work do we then send out into the world as a representation or as an intervention. And similar with Saya, I think like these one-to-one artists, collaborations, there, to a greater or lesser degree, there's sort of an explicit conversation around what the work is supposed to do, but then I have my own idea of what that might mean in my own body. But it's different when I work in community and try to bring, I'll just say dance, for lack of a better word, or a translation of expression. Maybe that's a better way, a translation of expression. So translating sort of a traditional ethnographic text of an interview into movement. And when that happens, the conversation is very explicit. So the conversation with those women in Cincinnati and the women we brought in to be a part of the dance was very explicit. We read the interviews together. We even meditated to the audio of the activist interviews. And each dancer kind of let that, whatever they felt, develop into their own choreography. And that was the work that we then took out into the world. But that process was very much about, and this is true of the young women in Detroit and Newark as well, allowing each person to define what that should look like and what that should feel like, what movement should look like and feel like in their own individual body, but still as part of this larger collective, and with the explicit intention of doing something in that community, in that local space, right? Doing something, even if it is simply just, you will see my Black body on the streets of Cincinnati, and you will pay attention to how I'm moving through these streets, right? But there was just a more explicit, I think, intention in the work with the collective of women, young and older women in communities. I don't know if that's answering the question around collaboration, because it's one I actually had for you as well, Autumn. And if I can ask you this, and I'm wondering if we could think about collaboration in different ways, because when I see your work and the work the beautiful work in the kitchen, but also I want to reference your work, The Wall, which is just like so mesmerizing to me. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about, or a lot of bit about, how you see space as a collaborator, both like actual physical built environment, but then I'm thinking about The Wall and like Galveston, that seawall. You know what I mean? And how, where we come from, like that placemaking of Houston for you, or the Midwest, the Black Midwest for me, as another collaborator, that even when we don't intentionally reference it, or we don't think we are, it comes into the work. And then I'm just wondering how you imagine collaboration at those various levels, thinking about, Black feminist geographies. When I think that, I immediately think of your work. You are, like, to me, the quintessential Black feminist geographer, because the way you not just transform space, but bring space into like a freaking conference room, right? Or the way that you transform what could look like a sterile industrial building to something else, with not a lot of props, actually. Just with, you know what I mean? Like with the tool of your body. So I just would love to hear you talk a bit about your practice of being in your body, and how you see space, like broadly speaking, as a collaborator in your work, or if you even see it that way.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I start a lot with architecture, and I start a lot with, who is present and who is willing to join in the work with me. So the wall piece, it started in Galveston when I was in a residency in Galveston, and I was thinking about the ways in which I was thinking about the Wailing Wall, and having a place to like lay your burdens down. And of course I was like, I was just thinking about the ways in which, you know, what is that? What is that wall for Black women and Black people? What is that wall? What is that place, right? And you know, traditionally it's been, you know, maybe the Black church where you can go and lay your burdens down like a ritual space. But I was just thinking about the ways in which we can make a ritual space within each other, right? Or the way we have done that as a practice, leaned on each other mentally, spiritually, psychologically, you know, yeah, physically, and in joy, of course, relied on each other and our bodies to produce joy for each other. So, you know, I wanted to work with older women, and I found 2 older women who were from Galveston, and I wanted to experiment of with them around that concept, ask them that question, like, what does it mean for you to rely on your sister for support, right? When there's no other place, when there's no proper site for you to do that. And, you know, we worked through it and we kind of, you know, created this choreography together, right? Because I really wanted to make sure that we embodied the work together. And I really wanted to see how, you know, these mature women in their 60s, you know, how they took up the choreography or how they interpreted movements and creating ritual, like even this at that stage in their lives. And, you know, Galveston, the seawall stretches 90 blocks, and Black people for a certain time could only inhabit 2 blocks of that 90 blocks of sea and water. Okay, and if you stepped outside of this 2 blocks of this, you know, water and sand and wall, you know, anything could happen to you. So it was very important for me to think about the history of that place as a port for bringing slaves to Texas, or excuse me, bringing people who were, you know, then enslaved to Texas as a port. And then that space also restricted, right? And how these women who had lived there this whole life on this island, really this, you know, island off the coast of Houston, you know, how they interpreted this space and geography and the community that they had built there. So yeah, so I redid the piece recently last year, and the team from the Studio Museum and Dance Space helped me bring women from New York to do the piece, to redo it and restage it. And it was so special because I'm used to doing that in Houston. I'm used to bringing people from the place into the work and having them reflected back, right? This sort of like dance and showing with their community, right? And I don't feel like I'm yet part of this community yet in New York, but it was such a wonderful experience to get to know these women and have them really quickly in a few days join in this choreography with me and create a new sense of geography and place and create another wall amongst themselves. So for me, it's the location, but it's also like building the location together with the movement, right? As you physically build a thing together.
Yeah, I mean, I just think is, you know, the way that you talk about the healing power of the collective is something that I've been thinking a lot about. So Fred Moten gave a talk at Yale last week, and he was talking about the, you know, Black social life, Black sociality as a method, as a way of being, right? That is a part of everything we do, not just something we theorize around, but how we engage, right? How we teach, how we show up in the world, and the power in that collectivity. And I was thinking about it as you were talking, and especially when we think about Black women in the ways that we've been, you know, defined as excessive and in excess, right? Needing to be managed, and how we can often find ourselves either in, you know, internalizing that, or in a constant stance of resisting that, fighting against and fighting for a different space, an alternative space of representation. But what happens when Black women come together in community is that there's a possibility for all of that to stop. Both the internalization and the need to represent the self to an abstract white audience or an abstract, evaluative or assessing audience, and just be together in that Black social space of collectivity, which is the answer, I think. And not just the answer to the wounds of the social world that we exist in, but it's the possibility to ask a different question, right? Or to throw out the questions, in the first place, but to even operate from a different place in the space of the collective. And I'm wondering too, we both work with women in various local spaces who don't necessarily define themselves as artists or dancers or performers. And I'm wondering about your experience, because I've gained so much, and I've been humbled in so many really generative ways in terms of thinking beyond the moving body as always dance, right? Or the moving body needing to take a certain form or be managed in a certain way, and how folks who haven't gone through like the disciplining of formal dance training find a different way of moving that is so productive for getting at some of the things that we're trying to get at in terms of like the work beyond the performance, right? Thinking about how to transform what happens in community, how to create space for people to live better lives. Like that, to bring a disciplined dance training to that question is just antithetical, but yet that's what you know what I mean? Like, to me, it's like, how are you gonna bring this overly disciplined like idea of what the body is supposed to do to work that is ultimately trying to disrupt those kinds of confinements? But it happens all the time. So I'm just wondering if your reflections on that, or what, just your feeling about like, even just like calling ourselves a dancer or not, or choreographer, just for everybody's, just side note, Autumn and I were talking last week, and I was like, girl, I don't even call myself like, it's in my bio, but I never call myself a dancer or choreographer, because I feel like even though I dance, I don't have the right to claim that. And I feel some kind of way about naming myself that, because I imagine that type of identity is also attached to a certain type of work in the world that is consistent and takes place in certain contexts and blah, blah, blah. And even, so I don't know, that's a lot, but I just wondered, like, I guess there's two parts to that question. Working beyond the training or the disciplining of the body, especially for Black women, right? When that's what our work is trying to do, and how do we then bring movement practice to folks who don't define themselves as dancers, even when we probably don't as well, maybe. But like, how does that kind of transmission of information, the learning of the choreography, even the naming of the gesture, the movement, for you, how do you practice that without like a redisciplining, right? Or reverting back to that kind of training and disciplining that has never been really useful for us? And then there's a question of just like, the labels attached to all of this work anyway, that do a certain type of violence, right? Or a certain type of erasure.
Yeah, I had a question for you, and I'm gonna, of course, answer it on your question, but I had a question for you about something I saw as a caption on your Instagram one day. You write very lovely, like short essays, but it was about, training your body through exhaustion, like your body being used, like the training for dance being about basically training yourself to work through exhaustion. And that was such an exhilarating, like mind-busting idea for me in a world that, I'm not obviously trained in a physical form. So I was just thinking about what it means to, for exhaustion to be the practice, and how, how it yields an amazing result, right? Tone and specificity and muscle memory and elegance and grace, but it is exhaustion and what that like does. So I'll put a pin in that. I want to ask you about that, but even the idea of transmitting that practice, right? Because I think when you're art making, you are invested in a type of exhaustion, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
how do you communicate that to people who are like, I don't need to exhaust first of all, my aim is not art, so I am not invested in that type of exhaustion.
Mhm.
But I
Mhm.
would say in my experiences with people, I think I really tried to pay close attention to the thing that they were already doing and could do with ease, and get them to slowly push push them forward a little bit past that, to see if they could move a tiny bit past the thing that they were already doing and well and enjoyed.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I'm
Sure.
just so curious. When I was watching The Wall, well, an example of that, you all need, if you haven't seen it, you should watch this. Was an example of that the woman who was sitting in a chair and her feet were like, was that part? I don't know. There was something so beautiful and mesmerizing about that simple gesture. So is that an example of something that would come out of just an everyday movement that seemed to feel good and organic in her body, that you sort of amplify or ask her to amplify? Or
Yeah, I think amplification. It was like, let me see you move your legs.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, you moving, like, okay, well, can you point that toe out a little bit more when you're crossing your feet like that? And like you can
Yeah.
normally point your toe, but it's like as a director, as a co-performer, I am invested in aesthetics, right? So I don't want to completely leave that by the wayside as a thing that should be tossed out in other things. We can have it all. But we can try to have a well-rounded, a holistic experience.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I'm just okay. So it seems that we have 10 minutes left and we should get to the questions. But
Okay.
I just I do, and I just want to say a quick thing about exhaustion in that post. I know the post you're referencing, and I think exhaustion specifically tied to the idea of not being enough. And so I remember very clearly two points in my dance training. One, when I was in Cincinnati and I was about 14, and I was dancing. I had this Russian ballet teacher. I was the only Black girl in this ballet class, and we all had decided. And I'm looking back, realized it was for my benefit as a form of humiliation, that all the little girls in the class decided they were going to ask the this Russian man and what they needed to improve, right? And so we were all staying in line and getting his feedback, and he just looked at me and he was just like, everything. I'll never forget that. Okay, girl, now I laugh, right? And then the second one was at Dance Theater of Harlem. Again, ostensibly, loving Black space, where I asked one of my dance teachers, he was a company member at the time, and I said, again, it was one of these things like, seeking approval, but kind of knowing you're not going to get it and kind of wanting to be humiliated is just a sick world. Anyway, I asked him how much weight he thought I needed to lose, and his response was, keep going until I say stop. And so there's this sense of, like, in both of those statements, but also just embedded in that world, like, you just keep going and it's actually never going to be enough. And you kind of know that, but just the practice of exhaustion, the practice of trying to aspire for something that's outside of yourself is something that was deeply trained into me. And I'm having to retrain myself and unlearn that and aspire for something different, right? And so my challenge, Autumn, that's why I love the way that you talk about aesthetics, is embracing a different aesthetic, right? And that doesn't mean that there's no standard. It's a different standard, right? It's a broader, more loving, more capacious and beautiful standard, but like a different aesthetic standard that, maybe it does include exhaustion, because there's something to be learned from that feeling in the body, right? But it's not about exhaustion embedded in the fact that you inherently are not enough, right? Which I think is so important. Autumn, I'm going to read some of these questions and then we can try to address them. Okay. Thank you for your questions, everyone. These are great questions. Let's see. This is for both you and I, as both of our works involve beautiful gestures. How important do you think the role of gender, self-identity wise, not necessarily biological sexuality, play in it? Does it become fluidish at some point, especially for Autumn? Do you ever feel space is gendered when you do interaction with spatial elements? Oh, that's interesting. And then there's a thank you for the presentations. And then there's an add-on. Well, that's a great question, Autumn, about sort of gender and space.
Gender in space.
You want me to add the add-on? Maybe it'll help. The
Yeah.
add-on is, what position do you take when you are performing? Yourself or more of a narrated figure?
You know, that's interesting. I feel like there is something in between the self and the performer, because I think the performer is not a thing, like the self brings the performer or gives the performer like the permission to perform,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you also, I feel like, need some distance to kind of have that freedom away from yourself, because yourself, you know, like you were saying, is may not think you're enough, but the performer is like, I'm the best thing that is existing in this moment that you've ever seen. So there's that. But gender fluidity, I do try to work towards that. But in terms of moving along the continuum, right? Fluidity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I usually do a lot of, in my performances, there's a lot of movement as it relates to other persons. So I do think about fluidity and gender as I'm reacting to another person,
Mm-hmm.
and deciding whether or not I want to be opposite, be the same, be alongside, be, you know, like,
Mm-hmm.
I think I allow that thing to play out more in that space.
In the
What about you,
interaction.
Aimee?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a, thank you for this question, because I do think it's making me realize, I mean, in my ethnographic work, I think I already name a category. So I often name Black girls, right? I'm naming them as a sort of a social category. Then I'm also trying to disrupt that naming in the ways that young Black women themselves rename themselves. And so there's a way that the question I'm asking already presupposes a gendered identity. And I think the work that I try to do with, for example, these intergenerational Black women in Cincinnati is to think both how their gendered lives, their gendered social lives are impacted in this space and both impact that space. So how are their movements, for example, along the Ohio River, like the gendered nature of that crossing from the north to the south? And so there's a social position that impacts them differently because they have been gendered. But then what does that mean for how we collectively conceptualize movement? Is the movement then gendered, or are we responding to other bodies? And I think the question, thank you for this question, because it makes me think about too, like the ways that I'm reifying gendered identities, right? Or the ways that there could be space to disrupt that, right? But it's so deeply embedded often in the question as a way to think about, what does this false naming, this gendered naming, do to people's lives? In the same way that we can talk about, race being, scientifically not a real thing, but it has very real impact in all of our lives, right? Like, so that's what I'm studying, the impact of these sort of false social categories that we create. But then maybe in the possibility of the movement, there are some answers to how we get beyond these categories, right? How people actually live in their bodies. And so what information is held in the moving body that might help us get beyond the confines of these social categories? Oh, I love that question. Okay, let's see. Oh, this is a good one. Denise says, what corporal shifts have you felt as a result of the pandemic, and how has that affected your work?
Well, definitely, performing from the shoulders up. Not performing, but I would say being seen from the shoulders up. I think that when it makes me, want to move more when I'm away from this box and engage the rest of my body.
Yeah, I mean, and Denise, I told Autumn this when we were talking last week, that I started this project. Well, everything is a project. I'm doing this thing with these people, you know, and they're my former students who we're all feeling very isolated in the beginning of the pandemic. So we started to send each other movement postcards. So we would send videos, like there are 4 of us total. So one person would be like the initiator. So Adam, like I would send you, maybe it's 20 seconds, maybe it's 5 minutes of me moving. And then I wouldn't tell you what it meant, but there would be some message I was trying to communicate. And then you would respond, and then it would go to the next person and the next person. And it's interesting because at first, you know, it's like, there's some dancing happening. And then as you go through it, as we continued on, it was like a close up of a blinking eye, right? Or just like a shoulder, or someone just like resting. And so even the way that all of us in this communication like got exhausted with our own performance, right? We were like, look, are we really trying to communicate about our embodied experience, or are we trying to dance for each other? And so after the first, you know what I mean? Like after the first 2 rounds, and it got really real, like where it's just like, no, I'm trying to express to you how I'm feeling in this body, which doesn't require all of this necessarily, right? It can come from a deeper, more organic place. So it's just interesting to chart how the definition of movement changed as we really like settled into like what we were feeling and what the purpose was, right? What the purpose of the movement was. Yeah.
Can I just say that I am so envious of the way the dance community loves on each other and communicates with each other, even though it seems like a highly competitive but collective form. The love and the playfulness that I feel like dancers maintain throughout their lives is just so exhilarating and inspiring. I love that. I love that project.
You know, I agree. And I will say, and what I just want to say this about Aimee. Aimee is I know I feel like I have to say the Aimee disclaimer. I learned so much, and my family is still very much tied to that Aimee organization and those dancers. And we learned how to love up on each other. It was brutal, you know, as those spaces can be, but some of my closest friends are still dancing with Aimee, and there's still that sense of playfulness and love that is so generative and fortifying. So yes. Oh, and we got to thank you for answering the question about gender. Let's see. Let me see if I can get. So just so you know, y'all who are still on the call, we're going to go to 2:15. So let's see, Autumn, if we can get a few more in. Charlicia, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, says, I've been wondering for a few years, do you find any usefulness in applying archival methods while discussing the body as an archive? Is there any application from the way we work in physical archives? Like specifically, yeah, if not, what's the retrieval tools? That's a great question. Do we find any usefulness in applying archival methods while discussing the body as an archive?
I'm gonna throw out a response based on just how I'm gonna interpret the question about retrieval methods of movement. I've been binge watching Living Single. And
I did that last year, yeah.
I've been thinking about these older Black TV shows as a record of movement and behavior, language, syntax, rhythm, rhythm in communicating. They dance on the show, the way they just sporadically do things, specifically the character Max. The way she's you know, super movement heavy. And I think about the ways that that the average person would retrieve something from our collective archives, right? When it comes to the way we move, the way we think, the way we act, and how we've been evolving. As I'm thinking specifically about, you know, Black folks. So that's my response in terms of what I think about archives.
It's such a great question. And I would love for, maybe in the chat, Charlicia, you can tell me if this is helpful, or, you know, I guess my connection to archives is, and you know, historians and other folks might, who are like purists about this, might say that's not an archive, but my archive, similar to you, Autumn, is everyday people moving in the world. It's a very contemporary, place-based, living, dynamic archive. And so as an ethnographer primarily, I'm mining from how I see people move in the world, whether it's just like, even when I'm not specifically in a research practice, as I'm just like watching people and picking up different ways of moving, that sort of is like the archive that I'm drawing from. And to connect this back to the pandemic question, just been really intrigued lately about how things like wearing a mask and being on Zoom changes the way that we move in our bodies, like, and what that lasting imprint might be. Like, there's a different way that people use their hands, and a different way because they're trying to express more fully because this part of the face is covered, right? Or in Zoom, someone mentioned this the other day, and I thought it was just so true. If you're in a meeting, when you leave the meeting, you're not waving bye to people, but in Zoom, you're like, bye. Like the ways that we pull from our sort of, you know, everyday archive of movement in this new moment to create new movement, right? Or to actually retrieve and movement that we don't normally use. But I think for me, the way that I look at archive, even when it's not directly connected to movement, is through what I can see in the archive of everyday life, through people, like how folks live their lives and how they move through the world. But I would imagine, like, specifically thinking about going to an archive, like a traditional archive. I would love to think about like what, you know, maybe what you're finding in the archive, like as different types of movement, or just even the process, the physical process of the tactile process of being in an archive. I wonder what that could teach us about movement. I think it's such a rich question. I love that question. Now, I said 15 minutes, I was wrong, Autumn. We have 10, we can go to 10 after, so we have 4 minutes.
Okay.
I'm gonna see if we can use one of these questions as a like, boom, we can wrap it up. Let's see. Oh, this is, I don't know. We're gonna try it, Natalie. This is a lot. Okay, you ready, Autumn? Natalie says, your aesthetics and definitions of embodiment are provoking. The recent question led to, how is metamorphosis, the simultaneous becoming and unbecoming, embodied within your work? This question stems from Jamie Lee's queered archival methodology, which speaks the body as archive via the way archives are living bodies and bodies are living archives. So it sounds like the question is, you know, really thinking about metamorphosis, so becoming and unbecoming, and how we might think about that in our work, or how is that embodied in our work?
Yeah, in our conversation on Friday, we talked about aging.
Mm-hmm.
And the body becoming something else, right? As it ages, and ability, disability, how it's moving, how we want a younger body. As I age, because I'm going to think about that, the becoming and unbecoming, to me I'm relating that to age, right? Mm-hmm. And thinking through ways to reinvent my movement in terms of, you know, sort of reimagining the things that my body has learned to do and put on, and the ways I'm supposed to feel about my body, and then hang my body because of that, and reinvent new ways of being, like through that process of maybe putting on different bodies, even different cultural bodies in my, you know, imaginary space. I feel like I can run through that process quicker. I think that's what I'm saying. I'm desiring to run through that process of quicker as a practice. So put it on, take it off, put it on, take on something new. Yeah.
I love thinking about that as like within the, you know, because when I think about becoming and unbecoming, I think of something as final. You know what I mean? Like, I'm leaving something behind. Like, how do I unbecome my training and this disciplining that is not so helpful right now at this point in my life, and take on something different that speaks to sort of a different type of wisdom or learning or knowledge that I've gained as I get older, a different way of moving. But that, I love the way that you talk about that process as like happening within the same day, right? Within the same project. Like, it's not like I've now transformed into this thing, right? That now has this new information in my body, or that's leaving something behind. But all of that is still residing in the same body, mind container, right? And how we work with that, and how we shift between what we once were, what we're becoming, what we're unlearning, the new information that we're gaining. And this it's not a linear process, but this moving through that space is just thank you for that. Thank you for that. It's really, really helpful to think about, because I'm mourning a lot of things in my own body as I'm trying to like celebrate the things that I'm gaining. But what would it mean to not feel like you have to discard, or, like in a final way, take something on, but move between those ever evolving spaces. Thank you for that, Autumn. These questions were really, really, really wonderful. I mean, so many. These are great. I'm just looking at the chat. So many amazing questions.
I feel like the questions are, we could build a whole nother hour into the conversation based on these questions. They're great. So amazing.
Me and Autumn will come back.
Yeah. So I hate to break up the conversation. I feel like we're just kind of getting into it. But Jina and I wanted to spend a moment to thank you both so much. I think that I took notes. I feel like we all have a little bit of inspiration that we got from this. I want to also remind everybody that our final conversation is on November 23rd at 1 p.m. And that's going to be between the Black School and Emory Douglas. And they're going to actually talk about collectives and co-authorship. So it dovetails rather nicely. I'm going to put the link in the chat for anyone to RSVP. And thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Autumn. I could talk to you all day long.
I know, Aimee.
Well,
so lovely to talk to you.
Continue to just you know.
That's true. That's true.
And thank you all in the audience for coming, because this is so great.
And Autumn, I'll just say really quickly, Autumn, I'm going to write about your work, so I do need to talk to you actually, because I need, anyway. I'll email.
Okay.
But I just want to put that bug in your ear while I have you in public, so you can't say no. But anyway.
Answer is yes.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Jina. Thank you, Jina. Thank you, Devin. Thank you all for being here. This was really just such a generative conversation for me. Thank you, Autumn.
Thank you, guys.
This was phenomenal. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.